There we go. So, welcome everybody. My name is Anna Campoverde, and I am the director of the Joseph A. Onano Latino Institute. The Institute provides scholarships, cultural programming, and professional development to students across campus. If you'd like to learn more, one of our work study students will drop our link into the chat box. You can also follow us on Instagram. We are at Jowly Shoe. So today we will be challenging you to think about the intersectionality of language and identity. But first, I would love to thank our Latino Institute student team who work year-round to put this programming together for our university community. And then thank you to all our co-sponsors, which you can now see on the screen. They helped us gather initial information and questions for Dr. Tseng and helped us promote this event to their students. Welcome if you're part of Dr. Lloyd's class. So during the event, we'll actually be dropping audience engagement questions into the chat box, and we encourage you to engage and drop your thoughts in as well. And if you have any questions when we get to the Q&A, please use the hand raise function to ask. And then we also ask that you turn on your camera so that Dr. Tseng can see the audience if you feel comfortable. And perhaps you identify as a Latino, but you don't speak Spanish. And for those of you who've ever felt isolated from your culture, you know, what does that mean, or what does that feeling even invoke? I know personally, I've oftentimes felt like I'm not Latina enough to be Latina. So to guide us in this discussion is Dr. Amelia Tseng, who's an assistant professor in world languages and cultures at American University and a research associate at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. She holds a PhD in linguistics from Georgetown University and her MA in Spanish from Arizona State University. Dr. Tseng's research focuses on language, identity, ethnicity in multilingual immigrant and diasporic communities. So Dr. Tseng, welcome. And I would love for you to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background about what led you to studying language and identity.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. It's great to see you, and I'm honored to be invited here. I have my coffee. It's actually not coffee, it's tea, but I'm prepared. So thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, Anna. And I just wanted to reiterate your point that we are hoping this will be very friendly and interactive. So, you know, don't be shy. We're going to be chatting away and have room for questions at the end, but we also really welcome your participation, your thoughts throughout. You can drop them in the chat, and I think we'll be able to check those every so often and kind of check in with those too. So thanks for being here. Let's see. Oh, and the other point I was going to make was just that it's wonderful to have such a range of interests and backgrounds here. And so the lens that we're using today, a lot of the lens we're going to be using to talk about language and identity is going to be thinking about Latinx issues, because this is, Café con Joe, but obviously it's not just a Latino thing. This heritage languages and identity is something that resonates with a lot of people. And there's a lot of intersectionality going on. So all questions welcome. And hopefully there will be things that kind of make you go, that rings a bell. That's something that that's something that I've seen or experienced, but, maybe I never had a space to talk about it before, which actually would be my answer, I think, to that first question, Anna, is that I also grew up with these questions in my life and in my family, but I never knew that it was something that you could study, that other people were thinking about, until I found sociolinguistics. And that was sort of a real aha moment for me the first time I took a linguistics class, because my whole life, I come from an immigrant family too, and I grew up in the Southwest, where there's a long history of multiculturalism, right? Historically with the Latino presence, and then with current migration, again, lots and lots and lots of Latinos, but also more and more people from other countries. So all of that was kind of going on in my life. My parents were speaking different languages at home. People were code switching all over the place. And people would sort of have feelings about it or react to it in different ways, but nobody was talking about it as a thing. So when I took this first class, I thought, whoa, aha, I'm not crazy. This is a real thing. This thing I've been seeing my whole life, it's a real thing. And smart people have been studying this, and there are ways that you can get a handle on this. It's not just something that me and my family do. It's something that's a bigger pattern. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. That's something that I really want to know more about. And I want to tell other people about it too. As a teacher too, I mean, I feel like it's really important to get a handle on this so that you can share it with other people, because so many people experience this and think, well, maybe I'm just weird. And it's not true. I mean, this is normal. We're the normal ones. This is so normal for most people. but it's not something that we have enough conversations about still, I feel.
No, I absolutely agree. And if you are able to see our chat box, we asked our participants to let us know what languages are associated with their cultural roots, and we're getting a ton of responses: Spanish, Russian, Italian, Polish, Urdu, Romance Spanish, Quechua. And there's a lot of responses going back and forth as some people speak their native language and some people do not. So I think, I first heard you when you were on Code Switch at NPR, and I'm going to ask one of our students, BR, to please drop that link if anyone is interested in hearing that interview. It is a fantastic interview on NPR's Code Switch with Dr. Tseng, talked about specifically, feeling this way that you just described of perhaps you don't speak a language that's associated with your native roots. How does that make you feel? So can you tell us a little bit about just what is the impact of not speaking Spanish or whatever native language is associated with someone's cultural roots? Like, what does that do to your self-perception or your identity?
Wow. Let me say first also, now that I figured out how to look at the chat, this is an amazing list of languages. What a cool group. There are so many languages and backgrounds and experiences here. Thank you guys for sharing these. Thank you all for sharing these, the languages that you might have grown up hearing, the ones that you've studied in school. This is so cool. So let me think. So I got a little distracted. The question was, how does it make you feel when you don't speak your heritage language? So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to sort of plant little seeds as we go along. Also, again, I know we have a diverse group, so you might not all be 100% with all linguistics terms. So I'll kind of put little definitions here and there, and we can come back to them if you want. But let me think here. So there's a lot to unpack, right? One thing is this question of heritage languages. Another thing is actually that I kind of want to come back to in a bit is, what does it even mean to speak a language? Whoa, very deep. But what does it actually mean when we say, do you speak your language or not, right? Because it sounds really obvious, but it actually is kind of complicated. But let me start just with this idea of heritage languages, or sort of the language of your roots. That's a strong one. I mean, that's a strong connection. It's a complicated question because language is so important to people. It's something that we all experience every day, but don't necessarily think about a lot. That was sort of my eyes are open moment when I took my first sociolinguistics class. I thought, wow, this is stuff that it goes on all the time, but I never knew it was a thing to look at. I think of language that way sometimes, sort of like water for fish or like air for us. We're in it all the time. It's a huge, we can't live without it. We can't do our lives, but it's everywhere. So we don't really think about it, right? Language is part of identity in so many ways. I think a lot of what we're probably going to end up talking about tonight is going to be symbolic, just sort of based on the theme and the interest. But part of it is also just really fundamental and practical. I mean, if you can't communicate, then you can't really do social interaction with people. And so on a really fundamental basis, it's part of how we think about ourselves and others, but it's also part of how we actually build the world. It's how we build our social relationships. It's how we do the kind of actions and work that we do. And of course, it intersects with kind of more concrete stuff and less metaphorical stuff in our lives, right? Like power, like structures, like the things you have to do with your body and your voice when you go to work, that kind of stuff, or school versus with your friends. But when we think about language and heritage, and I'm going to think also, I think a little bit about migration here, because sort of based on what I'm seeing in the chat, that's probably also something that's of interest to people, something in our family past at some point. Language means a lot to people because we associate it so closely with identity, right? We have this sort of feeling, and it's not an intellectual feeling, it's a very deep kind of emotional feeling, right? That what you speak is kind of who you are. It really says something about who you are, where you come from, where you belong, if you fit in, those kinds of things, which is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because that can be wonderful. It can be a wonderful source of pride to you. It can help you uphold your culture. It can give you the strength to resist discrimination, but it can also kind of make you feel less than if you're not in a position where you're speaking the language the way you sort of think that you should, right? And that's what happens. It happens all the time, right? I mean, it happens with dialects, it happens with accents, it happens with just different ways of talking, which is something we can talk about too, because every language has that, right? Like preferred ways of speech or the formal, official, fancy ways, and then more casual ones, or ones that your parents say to you, oh, don't talk like that or you'll never get a job, right? But a big issue with migration, right, is when people go to different areas, then you're no longer in a situation where there's one major language, even if there's different ways of speaking it, and everyone's using it at school, and you're growing up with, let's say, your cousins, right, in the country that your parents came from, and having that experience, that 100% immersion in that school. Instead, you're somewhere else, and you're having a different experience with two languages. And so the way you speak the language is going to be different. Just it has to be, right? You're going to be doing different things with it. You'll have different opportunities. You'll be able to do things that your cousins can't in a different language, and they'll be able to do things that you can't in your parents' language, and what people might call home language. But I think we should put that into parentheses, because it's a little bit simplistic to say, oh, that's your home language, right? If you came to the States when you were a child, or if you were born here but your parents were somewhere else, well, is it really fair to say that it's not your home? So this kind of question of hybridity gets in there too. So I keep using the term heritage language, so I want to explain that a little bit too. In linguistics, when we say heritage language, we mean something maybe a little more specific than what I would mean if I was just talking to my mom or something like that. And so I'll explain a little bit of the background there for that too. Heritage languages is a term that linguistics started using in the past 20 years or so, the past couple decades, as a way of talking about a specific kind, sort of addressing some issues that would come up in bilingualism that nobody was able to really properly address at the time. Bilingualism research is a huge and really interesting field, but back in the day, it had a problem. It lingers a little bit. We've been working on it. It had a problem, when that problem is one that still is around in society, right? It's this idea that in order to be bilingual, you have to be like two monolingual speakers in one, right? And so some of you might have run into this pressure in your life. It's this idea that, oh, you're bilingual, great. So you must be perfect in English and perfect in Spanish or Korean or Mandarin or Russian, Yoruba, Italian, Polish, all these things I see in the chat, right? And if you're not perfect, quote unquote, in both languages, then, well, what are you, So instead of getting supported for speaking your Russian, Yoruba, Cantonese, Korean, Mandarin, Spanish, as well as you do, people just say, oh, well, it's not that good. Oh, she speaks it, but she understands it, but she doesn't speak. Or, oh, he can speak it, but he's always having to put in words from English, that kind of thing, right? So the term heritage speaker came up to try and kind of say, hey, there's lots and lots and lots of people who have some kind of cultural relationship with a language and probably didn't encounter it for the first time when they decided to take Spanish 101, right? They probably heard it growing up or had some kind of connection in their family, but they're not, quote unquote, perfect bilinguals. They're not going to speak both of their languages to pop out in Spanish and sound like a college educated monolingual speaker, which is sort of the dream, right, in foreign language teaching. Oh, we want everyone to sound like they went to college in Argentina or they went to college in Spain, right? Well, that's not what you're going to sound like if you grew up in a bilingual family. And so heritage languages is sort of a field, a little subfield that grew up to try and look at these specific kinds of questions, to say, okay, what kind of situations come up? What's the identity work that comes up? What kind of challenges do people in these situations face in schools, when they do take AP Spanish, for example? So that was, I thought I gave a long answer, Anna. Maybe you want to throw another question in there and I'll keep going.
I think as I see a lot of head shaking, like nodding, not shaking, nodding as you're talking. And I just actually want to pull out the last comment that I saw, where it says that sometimes it's frustrating when you can't think of the proper words to communicate back. Can you talk a little bit about like the frustrations someone might feel, like if you're, for instance, like if I talk to my grandmother and sometimes I don't know the right words, I get angry at myself because I can think them in English, but I can't think them in Spanish. So can we talk a little bit about like sort of like what that feeling is like and how to navigate those kinds of situations?
Oh, absolutely. Although I don't unfortunately have sort of an answer or a handbook for that or anything like that, but absolutely, let's lean into that because I think that's very common. It's very common, and it's very common in families, for example, to have different, what we call linguistic repertoires across the generations. Your linguistic repertoire is just it's just, if you think about sort of your own, you as a person, the conjunto of you, your linguistic repertoire is just all the languages that you have at your disposal, right? So for a lot of people on this call, it's English and Spanish, but it's all that stuff people were putting in the chat, right? And it's all the ways that you use them, right? So it's not just your English and your Spanish, but it's the way you're able to code switch between the two, say, when you're telling jokes with your friends and your cousins in a way that like your grandparents wouldn't get, right? It's the way that you're using your Korean, even if you're not able to speak fluently, but you're still able to say, understand what your grandparents say, and even if you have to respond back in English or a combination of the languages, right? So it's really common for that to be different from grandparents to parents to kids and grandkids, right? And people are using those all the time to get their meanings across. So to the question sort of, you know, what do you do when you're trying to talk to someone? Let's pretend it's a grandparent here, because that's quite commonly what happens with a heritage language. And what do you do when you go for it and it's just not there? The answer usually is you compensate in some way, right? It's like if you reach for something and you don't quite get it, you use another tool. So typically what you do is you rely on your linguistic repertoire in some other way. You might code switch, you might reach out for support and ask somebody else in your family to help you by translating. That's a common thing. You might find some other way to communicate your point or the feeling that you're trying to get across. You know, if you're expressing respect, if you're expressing love, those kinds of things, they're not necessarily things that depend on a single vocab item. And oftentimes, as heritage speakers, even if you don't have the full, if you don't speak if you don't speak the language like your parents or grandparents, heritage speakers oftentimes have the cultural competence and communicative competence that goes with being part of this culture, right? That's another place also where a heritage speaker will be different from a second language speaker who's just started learning a language in a classroom, right? And some of you probably also know this from your other language classes. You know, if you're a heritage speaker, you come into a classroom, you know certain things that people starting from zero don't. And part of that is how to act, in a sense, even if you don't have all of the words, right? So people use all of this to try and communicate, even if they don't have the exact word. But it is frustrating. It is frustrating. And I think to your earlier question, too, and a big part of tonight's talk, it's frustrating and it can make people feel really badly, like they're less than somehow, like it's their fault that they don't know how to communicate properly, you know, like they're missing something. And I feel like that's a really important point to push back on as a teacher and a scholar and a heritage speaker myself. I feel like it's really important to shed some light into that because, you know, it's not your fault that you don't know all of the words in Spanish or Quechua or Tagalog or whatever that your parents do. Of course you don't, right? You didn't have that same experience. But so often it's sort of put on heritage, it's put on people as individuals rather than saying, hey, you know, let's take a step back and understand that just given personal histories, given social context, it's kind of unreasonable to expect that. So, you know, it's not a question of, you know, so-and-so doesn't want to talk to their grandmother or so-and-so, you know, so-and-so just never wanted to speak Spanish when they were a kid and look what happened. No, it's a lot more complicated, you know. And we can talk about all those things too, all the ways in which minority languages and cultures really don't get the support that they need to thrive. Pues a lot of the time, but you know, we're talking about the United States here, and it's quite common. Sadly, in the United States, we've been called a language graveyard, and you know, that speaks to a larger problem, right? That goes beyond just individual kids who, you know, supposedly don't want to speak a language. And, you know, sometimes they don't. Everybody goes through phases, and sometimes people do go through phases where they don't want to be different. But, you know, part of that is the environment too. And people, you know, when you get the message that being different is not okay, then you don't want to be different. I mean, everyone goes through that at least a little bit, like in middle school and stuff. But typically, if people get through that period with their language and cultural connection intact, then by the time they get to college, for example, they start to be interested in it again. But my bigger picture there was that, you know, it's not just about one family or one person or sort of your personal desire, whether or not you're rejecting your culture. There's really a lot of other factors at play, but we often don't see them, right? Of course, kids don't see them because they're kids, but parents don't see them either, typically, you know. they're busy. They're not studying the social environment. They typically don't see that either. So there can be quite a lot of pressure that makes you feel bad about it, as if you're somehow deficient, like to your original comment, Anna, like, oh, I'm not, Latino or whatever enough.
I think I definitely want to talk a little bit more about changing behaviors or just changing the way you talk. But before we get to that, we did ask in the chat box, we did ask, and this was actually one of the survey questions, if you selected to take the survey, we asked, have you ever felt isolated by not speaking your cultural or your heritage language, I guess? And then how do you connect with your culture and your history if you do not? So we have a lot of what I found interesting about the survey, I don't know if you did too, Dr. Tseng, was that everyone on the survey, everyone who selected that they do not speak their heritage language also selected yes under the question of do they feel isolated. Yeah, so as we're going through the comments, like I am seeing a lot of different times and examples where individuals felt like, it was frustrating for them to speak, or they do feel a little bit isolated from their cultural roots. So can we talk a little bit about, how do we reconnect with our roots when we don't speak our heritage language? But more so than that, the follow-up question being, I know one of the other questions, or one of the things you and I talked about, was the idea that Spanish is a colonized language, particularly Spanish, within the Latin American countries. So I want to first start with how do we reconnect with our cultures, but then if we can go into colonized languages, I think that was incredibly interesting as well. And then let me just add before you start, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. So that way after Dr. Tseng is done with this part of the question, we can take maybe like a question or two, and you can also drop them in the chat box as well.
Yeah, this is a great chat thread. I'm so glad that there's people helping to keep on top of this, because this is so amazing, and I can't talk and keep on top of it all at the same time. So it's great. It's great that you're helping out with that. I want to put something in the chat, actually, a link that you guys might find interesting before I talk anymore. Just with this idea of reaching for words and code switching and things. And code switching is such a rich topic. There's so much more we could talk about it, and I'm really happy to pick that up at any point too. I know that was a question in the survey, was sort of, what is code switching and why does no one ever talk about it with kids? Like, why is this the first time I'm finding out about it now? And I just now saw a comment up there about code switching with African American English too, which is another really important point and goes to that idea of dialects. But for now, I just want to put in a link to a really amazing poet that some of you guys might know already, called Melissa Losada, sorry. I think she's from Boston, and she's a spoken word poet, like a slam poet. And she does, she's written a poem that a lot of people have heard of called My Spanish, and she's done it in Spanish too, but this is the English version. So, that's something that, I don't know, you might resonate with you if you listen to it later on. Let's see. So, okay, so there it is in the chat. So then we were going to talk about, what to do, how do you connect? I guess one thing to think about, or one question I'd like to ask, is when you say reconnect with your culture, what does that mean? Do you mean reconnect with your culture like on a personal level, like, being able to knit together some of those ties with your family that maybe you feel have gotten frayed because you're not able to fully speak to your grandparents, or because your family is diasporic and so you're not seeing each other every day, that kind of thing? Or do you mean in the sense of kind of finding out with capital letters, like, what does it mean to be Colombian or something like that? What do you mean by reconnect with your culture?
I think in just seeing the chat box, a lot of it comes down to connecting with your family, perhaps the family that still lives in your native country, but then also understanding like the deep complexities of someone's, native country. Because I think I would say a little bit of both, because I know, what does it mean to be Latino? Like that has a lot of meanings, and that has a lot of interpretations depending on where you grew up, depending on who your family is. So I think it's probably a little bit of both, but we know, and you said earlier, like language, you're exposed to it every day, and it's just almost something you don't think about. So in the absence of having that, like how do you grapple with like reconnecting with your roots? Like we're more than our language.
Oh, I see what you mean. I mean, I think people do it in a lot of different ways. On the language side, a lot of people do actually try to strengthen that or pick that back up. I'm seeing in the chat also the different efforts that people have made as individuals and through their families to keep those heritage languages going, whether through speaking them at home or going to a school or that kind of thing. Other cultural activities are often really important for that too, like church and religious activities and different faiths. That's often a place where language and cultural ties stay strong. Those, sports, if you do, depending on your culture, just the places where people come together. So I think people do take the initiative to try and build those ties back. They also do take the initiative to find out more, particularly at college, right, from studying it. So you start to see people going, oh, I do want to do Latino studies, or oh, I do want to take a class in like Afro-Latino literature or find out about these things. So when they do want to pull those ties together, they tend to use kind of a combination of the resources that they can find to sort of educate themselves and pull that together. Also, a lot of times people do try to go back to their homeland countries too in some way or another. At the college level, people will try and do it through study abroad, or they'll do something like the Peace Corps, which might not take them to the country that their family's from, but takes them sort of to the region. A lot of people just try and go back however they can, whether it's to visit family or to work or those kinds of things. I feel like nowadays the world is much more connected than it was 50 years ago. And if we think on immigrant experiences in our families too, you can probably find some examples of how that's true. If you think about what it was like for somebody to come to the States from another country 50 years ago versus now, there's a lot more contact, right? It's possible to go home for visits or for a bit and then come back and forth in a way that wasn't typically as possible 50 or 100 years ago. People also keep in touch a lot more because we have things like cell phones and WhatsApp and FaceTime and the internet. So nowadays, diasporas tend to have a lot more. It's possible for them to have more communicative ties in real time than was possible before, and that actually does seem to be something that is helping people keep those heritage languages alive, because it's easier to keep in touch with your cousins and that kind of thing nowadays. But interestingly, it doesn't necessarily take place all through the channel of a single language, and I think that that's a really important point to bring up and to celebrate, because part of this thing with language and identity that we've been talking about, this construct, right? This idea we have that what you speak is sort of a big symbol of who you are, is based on this idea that, okay, we each have one, right? We have sort of one identity in one language. I don't think people consciously think that, but it's sort of an underlying assumption, right? And that sort of essentialist assumption underlies a lot of the way we think about the world, right? That's sort of what intersectionality is trying to explore and push back against, but it's still sort of an assumption that's out there quite a bit. And because it's such a powerful one, it just seems, it seems obvious, right? It's common sense. But if we put it in a historical perspective, then we realize that that's actually a pretty recent perspective. And it's one that's deeply based in Western modernism, Western nationalist development and modernism, right? So this idea of one country, one person has one identity, one country, and one language, it seems like, oh yeah, that's the way the world's always been, but it's actually not true. That's something that's really an ideology that's really sort of taken traction in the past few hundred years. And if you look around in history, there were tons and tons of places where that just wasn't true. There were like multilingualism was the norm, and it's still the norm in a lot of places. They just don't tend to be North America, or even Europe, which is very multilingual, but still has a sort of strong national and ethnic association with them. Africa is hugely multilingual. Asia is hugely multilingual. These are places where it's normal to speak 3, 4, 5 languages. Latin America is very multilingual too. And so are we in the States. We just kind of try and ignore that a lot. So when you think about that, then you think, if it's normal to speak multiple languages, what does that mean? Well, what it means is somebody who speaks 5 languages isn't going to be using just one of them with certain kinds of people in their life necessarily, and they're not going to be using each of them in the same way. So here I'm getting back to this idea about code switching and fluency. And I'd like to use a little example just of learning, right? You guys you're always learning, right? So if you think about your dominant language, let's say for the sake of argument here that it's English, probably don't feel real. You probably don't feel too insecure in that, right? You're good. You're good. That's not the one that you're worried about not being able to talk in, right? But would you say that you're perfect? Would you say that you know everything in English? That you're done learning? Yeah, you learn words every day, right? You pick up the newspaper back when people did that. Okay, now you open up your internet browser and you learn new words, right? When you came to college, you learn new things. I mean, the first time you went to a bank and opened up a bank account, you learn new words and ways of interacting, things you didn't know, right? And there's no reason you would have known how to open up a bank account before you did it. So we're still learning all the time. So that's a little bit of a silly example. But I think, it's a little bit of a silly example if we think about English and like, oh, is your English perfect? Are you done learning? But if you think about it, if you shift that over to your heritage language, then we can kind of see how it's more powerful there, right? Because that's exactly what we think and what we're told all the time is, oh, there's something wrong with your language. It's not perfect. Well, of course it's not. You're always no languages. You're always still learning. And somebody who speaks 2 languages or 3 or 4 or 5 is going to use them differently. Depending on what they need them for, right? Maybe one they use with family, maybe one they use at work. They're not going to have the same vocab words in them because why would they, right? So that's something that's very, very normal for bilinguals, but something that, again, doesn't get really recognized enough. And the connection here to the question about sort of how do you maintain these ties when you don't speak the language is we use all of that, and oftentimes we do a much better job at it than we get credit for. So nowadays, people come to another country, they bring their kids with them, they're staying in touch with people at home, and we can do that more actively than in the past because we can just, pop out your cell phone and text your cousin. But people are not necessarily doing that just through one language, right? The official language of the country that they left. Typically, they're doing it in a bunch of different modalities, right? They might in a bunch of different languages. They might be doing it in the national language, but also with their home dialect of it, right? Whatever language they speak in, whatever dialect they speak in their region. English is part of that too, because it's a really powerful world language. So if you're texting with your cousins and you're code switching, most likely your cousins can follow you or they're doing something bilingual as well. If you're talking about movies or something like that, it's most likely going to be a mixed language conversation. And so there's a lot of creative hybrid ways that people maintain connections and that they build new ones that are modern and relevant, because language is always changing and so are our identities. And I think that's an important point too, right? Is we don't, our homeland identities or our home culture identities are an important part of who we are, but they're not the only one. It's not sort of a question of like, oh, the idea of somebody who's bicultural being sort of trapped between 2 cultures and not at home in either of them is not really true. Certainly it can be uncomfortable, but there's also a lot of room for creativity and for new and really powerful forms of expression to come up. We see this all the time, right? We see it in art, we see it in music, we see it in global hip hop. All these things that people are doing to express themselves in their new lives and identities. And they're typically doing it, multilingually.
I think those are important points. And I see in the chat.
Cool.
I can hear myself.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone hear me as echo?
Another thing, if I can piggyback again before we go on, another thing that I think is important to mention that you all may have observed or not is that our home cultures aren't standing still either. And that's something which is often very interesting, right, for people who go back. So if you left your country when you were a child or a teenager, one of the questions in the survey was, do people also have identity issues sometimes if you leave and then come back, right? When you go back and forth? Absolutely, because everything in your life changes you, right? We're always changing and growing. And sometimes that makes us wonder, like, who am I anymore? Especially if you start to forget words or something like that. But, the homeland's not staying still either. In fact, diasporic communities tend to be kind of conservative culturally because it's almost like a moment in time. You leave and you take your family at a certain point in time. And then the ways of the culture in that sort of community abroad sort of stays the way it was with, they stay with the stuff that they brought, right? And then the home country goes on changing, right? So then if you go back, it's not the same country that you left, or it's not the same country that your parents left. Let me think of an example. I can think of, I'll give an example here from Asia right now, actually. China has changed a huge amount in the past 20 years. The way they do things now is just very, very different from the way they did 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. So, the language has changed, the culture has changed, the way that people do things is different. And so things that people do overseas, it can now be seen as kind of old fashioned. And the same thing could be said for kind of any country, right? Nothing stays still. And so now if you say, oh, okay, well, I want to get in touch with my heritage, I'm going to go back to, I'm going to go back to China, or I'm going to go back to Peru or whatever, and and be there for a semester or a year or whatever. It's not the same as when you left when you were a kid either. So that's part of that new mix that you experience, and the new cultural connection you're going to build,
I think those are really good points.
I think they're also
Dr. Tseng, you went on mute.
I think it's, oh, thank you. I think it's also important because it keeps things fresh, and that's an important point. That's an important aspect of this idea of kind of how do you reconnect with your heritage, especially for young people. It's really important to recognize and be supported in recognizing that all of our cultures are dynamic. They're always changing and evolving. And that's a wonderful thing. The really traditional stuff is wonderful too, and deeply rooted and important to know and keep going and treasure and keep alive. But there's also wonderful new stuff going on. And that's the part that often will grab your imagination too. If you go to Ecuador for a study abroad or to work for a year or something like that, you're not going to spend all of your time hanging out at the museums, right? You're also going to be doing things like going to pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, you would be doing things like going to music festivals and stuff like that. So it's live, it's a live thing. It's not just a looking backwards. It's also a looking forwards. And that's something that people have also said, hey, when you talk about heritage and heritage languages, isn't that a little bit of acting like it's all already in the past? And I think that that's a valid critique, that's not the intention of it, but words mean things. And, you can definitely see that way, well, it's not in the past. It's who I am now and what I'm doing going forward.
I think hold on one second, Dr. Tseng. All right. I'm sorry. I was being echoey, but I think I fixed it. But I think all of us have to grapple with, especially us that come from different cultures. We have to grapple with that dual identity from time to time. I want to take you back just a second to code switching. I know one of the questions on the survey. One of the questions on the survey was, what is code switching, and how or why is this not explained when you're at a young age and you don't realize you're doing it, and you don't even realize that it's a thing until you grow up. Can you explain to us kind of like what is code switching and what does it do?
Sure. I mean, I can try and give you the Twitter version, the 120 character version. It's a huge topic. So there's a lot more to unpack, and I'm happy to go into any aspect you guys want. Also, I just dropped into the chat a link to a video called Spanglish, which is from the University of, I think it's from North Carolina State, actually. By a really great linguist there named Walt Wolfram. And so it can't cover everything, it's only about 4 minutes long, but this is a nice video that I use sometimes in my classes that covers a little bit sort of code switching and what it means to people, that kind of stuff. But it's only the tip of the iceberg. Also, I just have to call out the title a little. It's called Spanglish, which is a word that we hear all the time, right? Like Spanglish, and we hear all kinds of other issues, like Spanglish and Chinglish and Konglish and, all kinds of issues, Singlish. So as a linguist, that tells me, right, and other people, not just me, that that's important. It's a thing that tells me that regular people who don't study this for a living are going around and they're noticing code switching and hybridity enough to give it a name, right? And with Spanish and English, they call it Spanglish, right? But it's a colloquial term. And so when you go to actually study it, it turns out that it's a little bit too broad, because when people say Spanglish, what do they actually mean, right? Like, it's one of those things that's kind of like, oh, I know it when I hear it, right? Like, I know it when I do it. But what is it actually? Is Spanglish when you're, having a conversation with your mom and your grandmother and your little brother, and you're switching between English and Spanish depending on who you're talking to? Is it Spanglish like when you're talking with a friend and you're throwing in different words when you can't remember something, or when you know how to say it, but it's something that happened at work and you're just used to using English when you talk about work, that kind of stuff, right? Like what is it exactly? And so as linguists, as language scientists, when we talk about it, we tend not to call it like Spanglish, and we tend to try and be a little bit more precise. So that's where the idea of code switching comes in. And nowadays there's also some other ways of thinking about it, like translanguaging, which is sort of saying maybe we should think less about putting languages into box and saying, okay, now it's in English and now it's in Spanish, and thinking more about just how people use all of these in combination. Because there's always some stuff that won't fit into the box. Some ways of combining languages that you're like, well, I don't know, if I had to label it, would that be English or Spanish, or like 40%, what is it? So it's an ongoing debate, kind of like what's the best way to describe all this richness of language behavior that people do when they're bilingual. But code switching in its sort of basic definition is literally just when you're using two or more languages in the same conversation, right? In this, or the same sort of communicative act. So it could be, it could be between turns. Maybe you're talking with somebody and one sentence you say, one thing you say is in English, and then the next time you talk, you just switch over to Spanish and then back again. It could be with sentences. Sometimes people do it between, we'll do one sentence and one or the other. It can be in the middle of a sentence. Like sometimes you start a sentence in one language and then you just kind of switch to the other. It could be just certain words that, it could just be popping words in there, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different things that can fall under that umbrella. But that's, so that's kind of what it is, like, technically. What I think is equally interesting, though, is sort of what it means to people, like why we do it and how we use it. And I think that is probably also something that's of interest to you, right? And hopefully we can get the chat going on this too, because people usually come up with good examples. If you think of times in your own life, like, why do you code switch? When do you code switch? I already saw one example here of code switching between African American English and I guess we can call it more standard English in different contexts to experience. What was it? Was it at school or work? Yeah, she says, I feel as if I'll be judged if I speak the vernacular, so I'll avoid that. So sort of switching to avoid linguistic prejudice. When you know that one way of speaking is kind of stigmatized, and why there's prejudice against it is a whole different packet of language, of social and historical circumstances, right? So that's one. People will often code switch, right, to make themselves look better or to avoid prejudice. They'll also code switch for solidarity, right? So that to show that you're part of a group. So to sort of show, your bona fides. And this is something I hear a lot with Spanish, right? Is that people or heritage languages is people will switch over, right? So that people know that they're part of the group. Or even if it's just throwing some words in there, just to kind of tag their identity. People also do it for all kinds of other reasons, though. They might do it for politeness. Oftentimes people do it to accommodate what they think is someone else's language preference. And this is something that bilinguals navigate all the time, right? Is, which language do I speak with this person? This is something that Latinos report experiencing all the time too when they're talking with people, is like, what language are they expecting me to pick to speak, and are they going to be mad if I do it the wrong way? They'll say, oh, people come up to, I did an let me think. I listened to an interview with one girl who was saying, oh yeah, when I wear my hair a certain way, people always come up to me and speak to me in Spanish. And when I don't wear it when I wear it a different way, then nobody does it. But if I'm wearing my hair that way and people talk to me in Spanish, then they get like mad if I don't respond in Spanish. Like I think I'm better than them or something like that. So, there's a lot of feelings around language all the time, kind of like, do you think you're better than me? Are you one of us? Were you not well brought up and that's why you can't do it? Those kinds of things. And, there's a lot of positive things around it too, which I haven't been giving as much airtime to, but there are a lot of positive things too.
I'm wondering if anyone would like to come off mute to share about maybe an experience you had with code switching, or when you use it, or when you feel comfortable, or when you feel like you need to use it. I know it takes some building courage to get off mute.
I feel like I can say something. Let me see if I can turn on my camera. Oh, hi.
Hi.
I feel like I spoke Spanish. That was my main language because I grew in Puerto Rico. But I'm also an American citizen. And when I got into the United States, there was always the question to my accent, like, foreign because I have an accent. So that's one or the other. And my level of English, because New Jersey slang is a real thing, and I will get lost. So that's one of the aspects. But surprisingly enough, this one was more surprising than the English. I felt like I code switched more drastically in Spanish because I was surrounded by Puerto Ricans, which I have a Caribbean lexicon, which I even had conversations with a professor that is Spanish, and he says like, "Oh, you use this word," and I'm like, "Yes, there." And I noticed that it's because of the connection to African and Taino roots. We actually still use actively words that are not Spanish,
Oh, neat.
and they're concentrated on the Caribbean rather than other Latin American countries. But I didn't really notice until I surrounded myself with other Latinos. So I actually had to like, that Spanish where you see, I think in the movies, like they do like cover up over, like I feel like I speak like that when I'm speaking to other Latinos so they understand me, and rather than using words that they look at me like I don't know what she's saying at all. So I
Yeah.
definitely code switch more in Spanish than English.
Interesting. I think that's a common experience, yeah, because Spanish has so many regional varieties. And sometimes, and it's fun too, people play with that. They get together at parties. Oh, how do you say it? Oh, you say that.
I have found 11 words for straw.
Oh, well, share.
Oh my God, no, because some of them are bad words in my country. So it's really funny. Same for bag. There's a drastic fight over the word in between Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, because the word in Puerto Rico is just the one that we use for bag, but in Dominican Republic is a really vulgar word, so it may get you in trouble. So definitely a few variants in the words, in Spanish words across the Caribbean and Latin America.
hmm Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful.
I can relate to Gabriela's struggle of figuring out that words mean different things across Latin America. And I think that just goes back to your point about dialect and how even that's like immensely different depending like what part of the country you're from. Like I know Gabriela just said that New Jersey slang is a real thing. I've always been in New Jersey, so I didn't realize that we spoke in a certain slang. And I know Dr. Lloyd, you said you're from Ohio, so you concur that New Jersey slang is a real thing. I know that when we had our original touch base, something that really stood out that you kind of shared was the notion of colonized languages, and kind of especially in Spanish, where and I noticed someone in the chat also put Quechua because that's my country's native language too. Is Spanish isn't our native language. Our native language is an indigenous language. Can you talk to us a little bit of kind of like those occurrences around the world?
Sure. You mean in terms of like in terms of language contact, or in terms of
Yeah,
people
like
sort
in
of?
terms of just like, when sometimes we don't think about that the language that we are speaking, like for Spanish, for instance, it wasn't until you said that it kind of kicked into my head, like, oh my God, you're right. Like Spanish isn't the language, the indigenous language of Latin America.
Sure. I mean, I think the name pretty much says it all, right? They're colonizer languages. They got, English, Spanish, a lot of languages. They got to where they are through colonization. One of the ways that language spreads obviously is through people spreading, right? And so anything that spreads people and anything that causes migration or that causes is going to cause language contact too. But obviously, sort of. The past few hundred years of Western colonization have obviously had a huge impact on the way the world is now and the one that we're living in. So, yeah, I mean, they are colonizer languages. We got colonized. The Americans got colonized, and we now speak their languages. Um, I think that maybe the question of awareness is an interesting one because it makes me think of this question of like perspective, I guess, because we're living in our moments, and so we see things, things just seem kind of normal. But then you have these moments, these aha moments like that, where you put it in perspective and you're like, oh, actually, there's a whole history here. There's a whole story here. Which it might be a little bit of a broader question than linguistics. The one that you're asking, it sounds like we're almost getting into the area of kind of cultural studies. And some of these newer debates that have been going on. There's been a lot of kind of public domain debates going on about colonial histories, right, and what that means and how to handle them. In recent years, I think they've always been there, but they've been getting prominence recently. So, one thing I can think about is the statues debate, which is something that's been a really big deal, particularly in the South, right? But as people have been questioning what it means to have representations of public figures in public spaces and what we should do about that, that's a debate that has spread over to that question about Spanish colonialization, right? In, for example, the Southwest, like New Mexico. I don't know if you have seen that news, right? But that same kind of idea of should these statues be up or down, or, in the park or in a museum or whatever, came up in New Mexico too with statues of Christopher Columbus, right? So that is, and in other places too. So these things come up and then the same debate goes on about them. I mean, I think it sort of is good for us as we're going through our lives, but also if we're going to do things like rediscover our cultural heritages, it's good to be able to think about things critically as well. Not critically in the sense of being like nitpicky and mean, right? But critically in the sense of like, critical studies kind of thing where you think about, well, how did things get to be the way they are? Let's think about history. Let's think about power. Let's think about representation and just think about, where are we at and how did we get here? And what does that mean? And that's actually something that I have heard from younger people, students, when they're thinking about their identities. It comes up a lot when they're thinking about their families, for example, right? The way that you can be part of a family in the same culture, but you're thinking about social issues could be quite different than your parents thinking about, I don't know, all kinds of social issues. And what does that mean? I think it's a good thing personally that to be re-examining and kind of, thinking forward. But it's a question that can come up too. It's sort of like, okay, well, what does it mean if the way that I'm thinking about this is not the same way that the parents do or that my traditional culture thinks about it? Then, what does that mean for my relationship with it? And there is pushback, right? There is pushback from people who will say like, well, you don't think the way I do, so you're not a real whatever, because a real whatever would agree with me, right? But again, I think that's a place where it's important to realize that no, like culture is always evolving. The way we think about stuff is evolving. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be living. It would be just sitting in a museum somewhere. We could make a parallel here to the Latinx debate, right? Which is, Latinx is a term and, where did it come from and should people use it or not? And that kind of stuff has been a real current debate for the past couple of years. And I think, and sometimes people say, well, that's kind of, linguistic imperialism, isn't it? Sort of people trying to impose this like awkward sounding English word on the Spanish language. But I think it's important to note that Latinx as a term came from within the Latino community. It just came from younger Latinos or Latinx people, right? It's not like some English language committee somewhere sat down and said, we will now put an X in all the words, It was Latino people, younger people, typically people who didn't see themselves fully represented in their cultural paradigms the way they were, who said, hey, we want to do something a little bit different with that. And it wasn't also just a US thing too. Something similar, a similar debate has been going on in the Spanish speaking world by activists and people, although, Latinx is hard to pronounce in Spanish. So they tend to go with like a U or an E or something that slides in a little bit more comfortably, an I or something like that. It's nobody's 100% yet exactly how to do it. But the point is that the debate is out there. And I think it's a good example of how cultures are always changing and how people are thinking about them as they go along.
But I think that's wonderful that cultures are always changing.
Agreed.
And like you said earlier, and I saw a lot of heads nodding when you were talking about how sometimes we don't think like our parents, especially if we're first generation. Mm-hmm. The way my parents, my grandmother, views the world is completely different. And again, it goes back to all the experiences that they had versus we don't have those experiences.
Sure.
You grew up in a different country with, even a dialect that's different than the one here. And I think that just all kind of falls into the construct of what becomes your identity and how you not struggle with it, but how you go through discovering who you are and how you connect with your cultural roots. But I would love to pull some questions from the survey. So I know one of the questions on the survey was, how quickly can one learn the language in their environment? And do individuals who live in other countries for extended period of times go through similar language identity struggles than ones that are bilingual?
I'm seeing some great stuff in the chat here too. So how people celebrate their cultural roots,
Yes.
which is great because so many of the kind of what do we do things are very personal. Everyone does it a little bit differently, but yeah. Okay, so the first one, and there were a couple questions, so I might have to ask you to repeat them. The first one was, how quickly can you learn a language?
Yeah, how quickly can one learn the language of their environment?
Okay, and then there was a third point I also wanted to make before we go on. Oh, I never fully answered the question why people don't talk about code switching. In a nutshell, I think they don't know about it. It's still people in general don't know about it enough as a thing. They tend to just think of it as Spanglish or as like bad, fill in the blank. And so they're not really aware that it's an actual thing that's normal that people do. And that you typically have to be very good at both languages in order to code switch, right? Of course, there are some times, and this is what people are always thinking of, where somebody just, doesn't know a language barely at all. And so they have to rely heavily on their other one. But usually if you're code switching, you know both of the languages really well, because otherwise you wouldn't make sense, right? It's not like word salad, It's not like you're just throwing words at the wall and seeing what sticks. There are sort of internalized rules. You know where it makes sense to put in a Spanish word or to switch to English, and where it just sounds funny. Or if you listen to ads on TV, like a lot of ads now are trying to be bilingual, and their code switching sounds weird typically. It sounds unnatural, and it's hard to put your finger on why, but it's just not where you would do it, right? So I think that's why people don't talk about it, is they don't know about it. And when they do, they think it just means, they think that it's like a bad thing and that they should push their kids not to do it. Which, I understand why they want to push you to speak your Spanish or your Korean or whatever fully, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the most efficient way to do it is to yell at you every time you code switch. What that typically means is just your kid will stop trying to speak their heritage language, because every time they do, they get in trouble, right? And then another point on that I wanted to say was speaking a language. When people say speak a language, it's also complicated, right? It sounds so obvious, like, oh, they speak it or they don't. But a lot of times people speak a language and they don't get credit for it if it's their heritage language, right? Like or they can do more with it than people think. Like if you can listen to your grandmother in Quechua and you can respond back, you're doing pretty well. You're doing better than most people would. Just because you're not writing your master's thesis in it doesn't mean you don't speak it, right? So that's another thing I think is really important, is sort of to give credit where it's due, so that everybody gets credit for what they're able to do bilingually and the ways they can speak a language, instead of sort of people with good intentions but kind of not really knowing, just picking on the one thing that you don't do, perfectly, and being like, oh, haha, like, see, there it is, they can't speak the language, because there's a lot more strengths out there than we get credit for. And I think celebrating those strengths is really important to help support people in maintaining these language and cultural connections. Okay, so how quickly can you learn a language? Just in general, it takes time. Immersion will definitely help you. But it does take time. And I think that that's another place where it's important to point that out, so that we're patient with ourselves and with our, with the people in our lives, our children or grandchildren or whoever. I mean, if you think about it, it takes years and years and years for a child to learn a language, but people don't yell at them when they're 3 years old and making adorable grammatical mistakes, right? They all go through that little period where they're like, I eated it. And people don't go, you're wrong, you can't speak, They go, ha, 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 it's 8, And, they model the language, but they know that they'll catch it eventually. So it takes a while. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind, especially if you're wondering, well, why don't I speak the language, the way I wish I did? Or, how come I studied it all through high school and I'm still not 100%? Well, I mean, high school is twice a week for 45 minutes. That's less than one full day of what a baby's exposed to. So it takes a while. But you will get there. You will get there. And the more you can immerse yourself in it, the better. And the more different ways you can try and learn it, the better. So that's one great thing too about technology these days is, there's a lot, and the world is so much more connected. There's a lot more communication. There's movies, there's the internet, there's all kinds of other ways that you can be interacting with language and culture that are not just, either you trying to study a history book or when you go home to see your family.
No, absolutely. You're so right. And I know so many streaming services now offer like a lot of films and television programs from around the world, which is amazing to see, especially if you're trying to pick up, another language and in place of going actually to the country that you're trying to speak.
Yeah, it's great. And even things like the news, you can watch it online and you can listen to it and you can read articles and then listen to the transcripts. There's a lot of resources now, which is really nice. Mm-hmm. I know you had a second question, Anna, from the list.
Yes. In the survey, the second question was, do individuals who live in other countries, who go to live in other countries for extended periods of time, do they also struggle with similar identity and language struggles? I'm trying to break that question down. I am assuming it is, I guess, like if you're in America and then you go to live, I don't know, in Austria for 6 months, like when you come back, do you now have similar like code switching, dual language identity, feelings? Because you're not from there, but you just lived there for a while. So you must have picked up cultural nuances and language.
I think it definitely impacts you, but probably I feel like that kind of short-term thing is more what people in your re-entry workshops would call culture shock. Because when you hear about this, when people go say on study abroad or come back, that's kind of how they frame it, is they talk about, oh, what's going to be different, and then when you come back. So I think that you are affected by it, but probably on a less a less profound level. For one thing, 6 months isn't really that long. It's not that long. It's not really. It's unlikely that your country has changed that much in 6 months. It's unlikely that It's not the same as migration. It doesn't change your relationships with the country and with your family and your culture in the same way. It doesn't put the same kind of strain on them. It's definitely long enough for you to get a language immersion experience and for you to get familiar with the culture, but it's not necessarily going to sort of. I mean, it will change you, but it won't make you Austrian, right? In 6 months, I feel like, and I could be wrong, everyone's different, but I feel like it's unlikely in 6 months that you would suddenly feel like, oh, I'm Austrian Anna now. You know what I mean? I feel like you would still feel like you are who you are, but you're living somewhere else for a bit. It will change you, but I don't think it necessarily will question your sense of yourself or will cause you to question your sense of yourself that way. But you probably will code switch. You will have an enriched linguistic repertoire, and it would be interesting to know if somebody has had that happen and then say started to forget some of their English words and what that made them feel like. Because that could be something that makes you go like, oh my gosh, who am I now? Something that you might hear from parents. And here in our conversation, and I keep saying parents. I'm using that sort of as a proxy for the immigrant generation, but obviously it's not always the parents' generation that does that, right? I mean, a lot of people also themselves have had that experience of going to other countries. But when you come to a different country as a kid, you tend to adapt differently than the older generation does. So there can still be that kind of generation gap. But, people will say sometimes, I went to another, when I stopped dreaming in my language, I felt weird about it, when I stopped thinking in my language all the time, I felt weird about it. Or, now I don't feel comfortable writing in my language because I don't do it anymore. And for an adult, I think I've heard that can be a really discombobulating experience,
That sounds like a discombobulated
But I think it's unlikely to happen if you go somewhere for 6 months, is the short answer.
I'm looking through the chat. So I was looking through the chat while you were talking. And there are so many stories of just like people sharing of when they code switch, how they celebrate their culture. And I think this has been an excellent kind of intersectionality of what, like you said earlier, we use language every single day. We use communication every single day, and sometimes you don't realize, how important it plays into your identity. And to normalize those feelings that you're feeling, especially if you feel like you're caught between two cultures, with which many of our students shared that they were. There's one last question in the chat box that the people want to know, Dr. Tseng, what is your native language?
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I'll do that. Hang on a sec, though. I wanted to piggyback off what you were saying before that, too. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to be seen, right? To be seen and heard, to shed light on these things. And I loved your word, to normalize it. Because sometimes it is a struggle and sometimes people are judging you, but a lot of times they're wrong. I'm just going to say that from a linguistic perspective, at least a lot of times they just don't know what they're talking about, which, is understandable. I mean, I don't know what a doctor's talking about. I don't know what a lot of people are talking about. But, and oftentimes it happens with good intentions, but, just because somebody doesn't understand it doesn't mean that it's not okay, And in fact, I think it's important to celebrate all this wonderful intersectionality and diversity and new and change and all these kinds of things that happen. Okay, my native language. Oh, well, like my constant theme tonight, it's a complicated idea what even is a native language or a native speaker. So, planting some seeds for linguistics, and maybe in future days one of you will study these things. But my dominant language is English. So I grew up in a bilingual household. But we would typically respond in English. So I'd say that that's my native language.
In terms of just what you just said, that celebrating the diversity, I think that's so important because, like you said, we need to be seen and we need to be heard. And I feel like, if anything, there were over 50 people on this phone call that potentially at one point felt like, what, am I doing something wrong? Is this wrong? Am I not enough? And I think that this conversation has been extraordinary in the sense of normalizing having those feelings and just code switching. I know I do it all the time personally, but I think, we found a community. And as we bring these conversations to campus, it's really important to us, to always give students actionable items in the sense of thinking, you're not alone. And there's a lot of people who go through this, especially if you speak multiple languages, if you grew up somewhere, and you were born, or if your family's from one place and you grew up somewhere else, or you're traveling in between countries and continents. I think it's always important to, again, feel seen and feel heard. And I think you helped us do that today, Dr. Tseng. So, before we close out, I just want to give you an opportunity to, is there anything else you'd like to share with us or any questions you want to ask from the group?
I mean, I could ask so many. I'd love, but then the conversation would never end. I mean, this chat is amazing. This conversation's been amazing. I would love to just keep talking with everybody here, but, it would never end. But that's a good thing, actually, that conversations don't end. So we can kind of think of it as an ongoing conversation, even if we don't keep it ongoing right exactly now together. I really am glad and honored to have been here with you, and so appreciate everyone being here and all of your discussion, all of the sharing. And I hope, I hope it's been helpful in some way, and that this is something that, you can take with you going forward. I hope it'll open up more discussions in the future. Discussions with family, with friends, all those kinds of things.
And for everyone in the chat, if you'd like to connect with Dr. Tseng, we put in her faculty profile from American University into the chat box. If you want to learn more, or if you want to have a chat with her, please contact her. She's absolutely wonderful. And Dr. Tseng, we just want to thank you so much for your time. Again, I just feel like you have let everyone feel heard. With some of the struggles that some of our students have brought to our attention. But again, thank you for helping us capture, language and identity, and at least opening up this conversation. And we hope that we can welcome you again later in the semester or in another semester. But I think, like you said, we can talk about a lot of these things for hours. And I just want to thank you for your time and your expertise. I think everything you said was just it just sounded so normal, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. I'm so glad. Yeah, I'd love to.
But yeah, well, everyone, thank you so much for coming to our virtual Café con Joe's, our first of the semester. Thank you so much, Dr. Tseng. Huge round of applause for Dr. Tseng. And we have our upcoming events listed on our website. We do Café con Joe's every month. It's an intimate conversation and a deep dive into various topics. So our March topic is going to be mental health. So if you're interested in that, please keep an eye out on our website. But other than that, I hope everyone has an absolutely wonderful night. And thank you so much for joining us today. Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you
so
all.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.